When a function call is made, at that time control will going to be jump from calling function to the called function. If the main function is not returning a value, the data type void can be used as a return type specifier. The function call statement contains the name of the function and the list of arguments to be passed. We have two kinds of variable. One is local variable and another one is global variable. Hello everybody, welcome back to the session 2 on chapter 13, that is user-defined functions. I am Rohini TS from the Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. In the previous session of this chapter, I have discussed regarding the definition of a user-defined functions. Already we got to know that user-defined function is a function which will going to be designed or which will going to be written by the user in order to solve their problem. That is what the definition of user-defined functions. And also I have discussed regarding the advantages of having this user-defined function. So when I wanted to have a repeated set of statements more than one time in a program or anywhere in a program or even outside the program, if I wanted to use that function, then we are going to make that as a user-defined function, and it is going to allow us for the reusability and flexibility will be there, and it will going to have a modular approach. That means problem is not considered as a single unit. Instead of that, it will be divided into number of sub problems or a sub modules, so it will be easy for the implementation, development, as well as for the testing as well as debugging. So these are all the advantages of having this user-defined functions. And also I have discussed regarding the function definitions or a structure of user-defined function, how it will going to look like when we are using it in a program. First, we have to specify the return type specifier. So we have to write return type specifier that specifies the type of a value that it will going to return. So that will going to give me the return type specifier. Again, I have to specify the name of a function. So in order to get to know what is the name of a function in a program, it is mandatory to have this function name. After that, within a parenthesis, if there are any arguments, I have to list it out, argument list along with its declaration. So that I wanted to use. So you should not put semicolon over there. If it is a semicolon, it is consisting of a semicolon, it won't execute the further statement. It won't come inside the loop. So should not give semicolon. Then it has to open a flat braces and we have to close a flat braces. So within that, I am going to have a local variable declaration and we are going to have n number of executable statement. So executable statements will be there. Then I have to return some value back. So that is what? Return of expression. At last put semicolon. So this is what the structure of a user-defined function. That is what I have discussed in my last session. So in our today's session, we are going to learn about the calling a function. So now I defined the function. I just wanted to make it active. I have to get the benefit of having this user-defined function. Then we have to call that function. We have to make that execute. Then how we are going to do that? That I will be discussing in my first content. Then we have a main functions. So if I am executing any of the program, it is mandatory to have a main function. How this main function will going to start or how this main function will going to work, what is its syntax, example, everything that I am going to discuss in my today's session. Along with that, we have a returning a value. So if you just have a look regarding the function prototype or a function structure, there I have a return value. So that is what return of expression. It will going to return some value back to the main function. How it will going to work, that I wanted to discuss here. Then we have a function prototype, then types of arguments. So within the parenthesis, I have a list of arguments. Then what are the types of arguments we have? How it will be used in a program, that I am going to discuss. Then I will be discussing regarding this local variable and global variables. Along with that, we are going to learn about scope of a variable. So where it has a weightage, how can we use it everywhere, or how can I use where in the program, that and all I am going to discuss in my today's session. So let me get into the today's session, that is regarding calling a function. So now we'll see about this calling a function. So before getting into this, you have to remember two things. So when I'm writing or when I'm defining a function, it can be takes place even before the main function, even after the main function, or within the main function. Okay, there is no restriction of having the definition of a functions or a user defined function. There is no restriction like that. I can have it even before the main function, I can have it even within the main function, and I can have that user defined function even outside the main function. That is what you have to remember. So when I'm using this user defined function, then we have to remember two things. One is calling function and another one is called function. So now let me explain. Consider this is a calling function and this is called function. Calling function and called function. Okay. And I have a user defined function. Now I can write it either even before the main function, after the main function. Then what about this calling function? So calling function is nothing but it is a function that will going to transfer the control from it to another function by specifying the name of that function and passing the arguments. So now let me explain. So initially we are going to have a header file, right? So I should include iostream.h and we are going to have some of the header file which is required for my execution of a program. Then we have a main function. Let me consider that as a void main. Okay, so within that I am going to have several set of lines. I have a several set of lines. So here I am going to have a function call. So this function call will going to transfer the control from function call to the called function. That means I wanted to make another function needs to be executed some of the statement. Calling function, called function. So in the calling function, I have several set of code. Along with that, I have a function name and within that, I have a argument list. If I wanted to perform the addition of two numbers, at the time, I am going to specify the name of a function as a sum and within the parenthesis, I am going to send 10, 20. That means what? I am sending the value. I am sending the parameters to the called function. So when I am encountered this statement in the calling function, at that time, control will going to be moved from this calling function to the called function. So in the called function, it will going to receive some values from the calling function. Then it will going to make it active and it will going to execute or it will perform some of the operation which has been specified by the calling function. So after doing some of the executions or operation, it is done with the execution. It has to send the resultant back to the calling function. At the time in the called function, we are going to have a return value that will going to return the value, whatever the resultant that we got after the calculation of an operations or after performing of the operation, then it has to send a return value back to the calling function. At the time, again, control will going to be moved from called function to the calling function. That is what you have to understand. First, calling function will going to specify the name of a function. It will going to specify the function definition. So what are the operation it has to take place? What are the arguments list I have? That and all it will going to send. So when the control reaches from calling function to the called function, in the called function, it will going to execute several set of statement which is specified by the calling function. After doing the operations or performance, it has to send the resultant back to the calling function again, so that the control will again move from called function to calling function. Whatever the operation it has been done, that resultant will going to be showed in the calling function again. Then it will going to execute the further statements after the calling of a function. So without calling, no function will going to get invoked. That is what the reason we have this calling function. So this calling function is a function that will going to transfer its control from it. Initially, it has a control over the function. Then that control will going to be moved to another function. That another function is nothing but called function. When your friend is going to pick up your call, only when you are calling him or her, so then only they can pick up. They are going to talk, they are going to do some of the operation. Again, they are going just what they are responding you back. That is what you will be the calling function. Your friend will, to whom you are calling, they will be the call function. So the control will going to be moved from calling function to called function. Whatever the information that you wanted to send, you are going to send from calling function to called function. By making use of that information, called function will going to perform some of the operation. Again, they are going to return value back to the calling function. That is what the response that we are going to get from called function to calling function. So here, control will going to be moved from it to another function by specifying the name of that function, and it has to send the arguments. So here you just consider I have a sum of two numbers. So what is the name of a function? Let me consider sum, and I wanted to have 10, 20. So I'm just going to specify the list of an arguments along with a function name. When the compiler encounters this function call, at that time control will going to be moved from calling function to called function. That called function can be even before the main function, after the main function. That is what you have to remember. So now here called function. What this called function will going to do? So called function is a function that receives the call. So it will going to receive the call from the calling function and arguments from another calling function. Then only it has the ability to operate with the values that it has been sent from the calling function to called function. Okay, so here function call is the statement that is used to call or make another function execute. What is this function call? I'm making active of another set of statements. So when this function call is encounter, several set of statement will going to be invoked or executed with the help of this call. So this is regarding what? Calling a function. So now we'll see here when a function call is made. So now I'm transferring a control from calling function to called function. So when a function call is made, at that time control will going to be jumped from calling function to the called function. Initially it was with calling function. When a function call is made, the control will going to be moved from calling function to called function. Then what about the general form or a syntax that you can see here? That is variable is equal to function name and argument list. So if I wanted to send sum of two numbers, let me consider C is a variable here and function name is sum, and I am going to send 10, 20. So this 10, 20 is a list of argument and sum is the name of a function, and that value will going to be the whatever the values that I am sending within the argument list will going to be moved to the function definition, that is called function. So by making use of 10 and 20, it will going to perform the addition of two numbers. That value will going to be stored in this variable. That is what the reason we are having this variable here, or we can also write like this variable function name, and this could be empty. That means if you are not sending any of the argument to the called function, then it can be empty. So if I am not sending any of the arguments, then I can write like this. I'm just calling a function sum. So wherever the definition of this sum is there in the program, that will going to be executed or that will going to be invoked. So this is the general form of having this calling function. So we'll see the example. So here function name is biggest. What is the function name? It is biggest. I'm sending the variables. I'm sending the argument list. What and all I require. So A, B, C. These are the three arguments. So whatever the operation that it will going to be done by the biggest. So it has a definition either in the main function, after the main function, even before the main function. So when this calling function encounters in a program, at that time the control will going to be moved from this point to function definition or a structure of a user defined function. After doing all the calculation, the value will going to be stored in the variable called big. So here variable is big and function name is biggest, and the list of arguments are A, B, C. So this is regarding calling function. So now we'll see about this main function. So as we all know that without main function we can't execute anything. So it is mandatory to have a main function where the actual execution of a program will going to get started with the help of this main function itself. So the main function returns a value or a type into the operating system. So you may have observed that I can write void main, or else I can write int main. Okay, so there are two possibilities of having this main function. It could be the return type could be either void or a int. So when I'm having this void and int, that main function has to send some value back to the main function. So we can have either void data type or a return type or a int as a return type in the main function. So when we are having this void and int return type, that will going to specify the value that we are sending from the main function to operating system. So when I wanted to return some value back to the operating system, at that time we have to use this int main. So when I'm having int, then there will be a possibility of returning a value. But when we are having this void, it won't return anything to the main function, or it won't return anything to the operating system. So that is what when we are writing it, we have to be very conscious whether we are using void or int. If we are using void, it won't return any value back to the operating system. If we are using int, then it will going to return some value back to the operating system. So here, if the programs run successfully, 0 is returned. 0 is nothing but what? There is no errors in the program. So when the program is successfully executed and all, 0 will going to be returned from the main function to the operating system. So otherwise a non-zero value is returned to the operating system if there is an error that indicates that program contains errors. So if we are having errors, then there will be possibility of returning the non-zero values. So that specify the number of errors. But when the program is successfully completed or executed, then it will going to return a 0 to the operating system. So if the main function is not returning a value, the data type void can be used as a return type specifier. So when I don't want it to return any value back to the function, or I don't want it to return any value back, then we have to use this void as a return type. If I wanted to return some value from the main function, then we have to use this int main. So here you can see the general form. So when I'm using int main, int is a return type here. If it is integer, it will going to return some value back to the operating system. Int is a return type and main is a function name, and within that we are not sending any arguments. Remember dear students, you should never put semicolon in the int main or void main, because the actual execution of a program will going to get started when it encounters the main function. So that remember, you should not put, or you should never use semicolon in the main function. Okay, so all the executable statements will going to be enclosed between the curly braces, that is opening and closing of a flat braces comprises of several executable statements. So when I'm having this int as a return type, then it has to send some value back to the operating system. So when it is returning 0, that indicates that there is no error in the program and the execution is successful. And here we can see that we have a void main. When I have a void main, we should not contain this return value. It will going to send, it won't return any value back to the operating system, but it may comprise of any number of executable statement, and that will going to be enclosed between the opening and closing of flat braces. So this is regarding main function. What is the next topic? That is, we have a returning a value. So now already we got to know that we have a calling function and a call function. In the calling function, I am going to send the function name and the argument list which is necessary for the operations, or which is necessary in order to perform some of the statement to be executed. After doing all those calculation or after doing all those operation and all, it has to send some value back to the main function. No, that is what the reason we are going to have this return value. After doing the calculation, it has to send some value back to the calling function. By making use of that return value, we are going to get to know the resultant. That is what the reason of having this returning a value. So when a function is called, the statement in the call functions are executed. The control is coming from calling function to called function. So in the call function, statements will going to be executed. After that execution, the statement of a function returns a value. It has to return a value. Where it's supposed to return? It has to return a value to the calling function. After the execution of this return statement or calculation, it has to send a value back to the calling function. So that is what the reason of having this return a value. So it will going to, the return statement is used to return the value. After the calculation, it has to return a value back to the calling function from the called function. Next, a function can return only one value. I'm doing lot of things in the call function. I have 100 lines of code, but how many return value it can send? It has to send only one return value. So you can have any number of return value in the call function, but based on the statements or based on the condition, it will only going to return only one value from the particular user defined function. So in a one user defined function, it can return only one return statement, or it can have n number of return statement, but it will going to send only one return value back to the calling function from the called function. So a function can return only one value or none to the calling function. There is no restriction of returning a value. It need not to be mandatory. So if I'm doing some operation, if I don't want it to return any value, then no problem. But if I'm returning a value, then it has to return only one return value from the called function to calling function. So now we'll see how the general form or a syntax we are going to have for this in order to returning a value. So here, return is a keyword. Return is a keyword. So within that, I can send any expression. So if I'm saying this expression, it can be variable, it can be expression. Let me take one example. So I can specify return of C, or else I can use return of A plus B. Okay, so whatever the operation that we are going to do, based on that we are going to send a value back to the calling function. If I don't want it to return any value back to the main function or a calling function, at that time I can send it as a return 0. That means that indicates that program is executed successfully without any errors. So that is what the general syntax of this return statement. If I wanted to send any expression, I have to enclose that within that parenthesis. If you are sending a non-zero values, or if you are sending a 0 as a value, then it can be takes place or without using this parenthesis. So this is regarding what? Returning a value from the called function to calling function. So now we'll see what is this function prototype. Already I have discussed regarding the structure of a function. So what is the first line that I have discussed? What was the first line? I have a return type specifier. I have a function name. Within the parenthesis, I have a list of arguments along with its declaration. But did we mention the semicolon at last there? No, because that is the function definition. Function declaration is different. Function definition is different. Okay. When I wanted to use a function definition, it has to be declared first. That is what you have to remember. That declaration of a user-defined function is termed as this function prototype. We are going to specify the return value or return type specifier. Then I have to specify the name of a function. Within the parenthesis, I have to specify what are the arguments that I require for my operation. That indicates the function prototype. Important question. What is function prototype? Here, function prototype is a declaration of a function. As I told, declaration is different, definition is different. So in the definition, we have a body of a function, but in the declaration, we have only head. So that head part of this function or a user-defined function needs to be ended with semicolon. That is what the difference of function declaration and function definition. So when you are admitting a college, at that time, I just know what is your name. But when you get into the class, then I will get to know how we are and how is your studies all about. That and all we are going to get to know. So that declaration, that is admitting to a college along with a name, that is what declaration. So after that only I can have the definition of that particular function. So here also function prototype is nothing but it is a declaration of a function that will going to tell the program about the type of the value that it will going to return by the function, that is return type specifier, and number and type of a arguments. How many arguments I am sending? What is the number of arguments? What is the name of a function I am using? That will going to be specified by the function prototype. So here you can see the general form here. It is just like a function definition, that first function header. So you just recall at a glance that what we had, return type specifier, that specifies what kind of data it will going to return after the calculation. Then name of a function and type, I have to specify the data type and argument 1, and I can have any number of arguments. And here after that, or else we can also write like this, return type specifier, function name, and we can have any number of type. That is regarding function prototypes. So at last we are going to put semicolon that indicates the function prototype. It is just a declaration. So when I wanted to define it, we should not use this semicolon. Then it will going to have a opening and closing of flower braces. Along with that, I can have this number of statement. So at last we have to use a semicolon in order to declare the prototype of a function. What is the example? Here int. Int is nothing but return type specifier, and biggest is the name of a function. What are the arguments I have? I have 3 arguments or a parameter, that is x, y, z. I am declaring all the arguments separately with the help of this comma. That I have to specify the type that indicates the data type, int x, int y and int z. Or else I can just specify the type. So that is what the second type of prototype. So that is what int is a return type, biggest is the name of a function. I am not using what are the variables I am taking. Instead of that, I am just specifying the number of arguments along with the type of arguments. At last, you should not forget to put this semicolon that indicates the function prototype. I hope you all understood with this function prototype. So next we'll see types of arguments. So till now in the function header or in the function definition and all, we have discussed arguments, we have discussed about the parameter. Then what is this parameters is all about? What about this argument? What are the variables I can call this as an argument? So we'll see now. A variable in a function header, the variable in a function header is called as the arguments. So there I am going to use a return type specifier, right? I am going to use this return type specifier. Then I have function name. I have a name of a function, and within the parenthesis I am going to use some of the declaration of a variable. That variable will going to be termed as a argument or a parameter. So the arguments are used to pass information from where I am sending the execution part. So I am sending the control from calling function to called function. Whatever the variables that I am going to declare in the calling function, that too in the header part, then that information is going to be sent from calling function to the called function. That information will going to be used in the called function for the calculation. After that, it will going to return a value back to the main function or a calling function. Then what are the types of arguments we have? We have 2 types of arguments. One is actual arguments and another one is formal arguments. So we'll see the first type, that is actual arguments. What is this actual argument is all about? So we know we have a calling function, we have a called function. Whatever the variable that I am going to declare in a function definition or a call, that variable will going to be termed as arguments or a parameter. Then what about this actual arguments then? We'll see now. The function call statement contains the name of the function and the list of arguments to be passed. So that specifies when I'm calling a functions. So as I told, how we are going to call the function? I have a function name and I have a list of arguments. So within here, that needs to be executed for that needs to be assigned for the variable. This is what function call. Whatever the variables that I'm using within the parenthesis as a list of arguments, that arguments will going to be called as a actual arguments. So whatever the value that I am sending will be termed as what? Actual arguments or a parameter. If I am sending 10, 20, this 10 will going to be assigned to A and this 20 will going to be assigned to B. These 2 values or a parameter will be termed as what? Actual arguments. So these arguments are parameters is called as actual arguments. Where it will be? It will be in the function call statement. Then this argument can be either constants, variables or any expression. So here if I'm having A is equal to 10, B is equal to 20, C is equal to 30. Okay, consider everything is int. So then if I'm sending sum of A plus B, B plus C, comma A plus C. So these are all the expression. So this argument list, whatever I am sending as the actual parameter, can be constant value. If I am using only 10, 20, 30, it won't get changed. That is what constant value. I can use a dynamic values called variables, or it can be expression. That is a combination of operators and operands. So whatever the value we have for A and B, that will going to be calculated, and that will going to be assigned as a value for the first arguments. So these kind of arguments, whatever we are going to use in a calling function, then that argument is termed as actual arguments or parameters. So here biggest variable, so is equal to biggest. Already we have discussed about how we are going to call a function. Biggest is the name of a function, and I need to specify the list of arguments which needs to be separated by a comma. At last, don't forget to put semicolon. This is what function call. So here I am using 3 variables or 3 arguments. These kind of arguments will be termed as actual arguments. So now we'll see about this next type, that is formal arguments. So now you just need to play with only calling function and a called function. In a calling function, we are going to specify a variable, along with that assigning the value of that particular function name and list of arguments to the particular variable. Whatever the variables that I am going to use, or whatever we are going to write it as arguments, that is termed as actual parameters or arguments. But when I am declaring the definition, that means when I am defining the function, there we have a header and we have a body part of a user defined function. So in the header, I am just going to specify return type as well as the function name. Within the parenthesis, we are going to use some of the arguments or variables. That kind of variable will going to be termed as what? Formal arguments. So that calling function is important. When the control will going to be starts with, or when the control will going to be moved from the calling function to the call function, at that time call function header will going to receive the value from the calling function. That is what formal arguments or parameters will going to receive the values from the actual parameters or arguments. That is what the reason. First we need to have a calling function. Only when the compiler encounters that calling function, then the control will going to be moved from calling function to called function. Whatever the variable that we have in a call function will be termed as this formal arguments or a dummy arguments. So now we see now the function header contains the return type specifier. You just glance the definition of a function. So there initially we have a function header that comprises of what? I have a return type specifier and I have a name of a function and list of arguments with their declaration. So whatever the declaration that we are going to do in the function header along with the arguments or parameter, that kind of variables will be termed as this formal arguments or a dummy parameters or arguments. So these arguments are called as formal arguments or a dummy arguments. That means it won't have a value. Whatever the value has been sent from calling function to the called function, this called function will going to use the value of calling function. That means it will going to receive the value from actual parameter. Then by making use of that value, it will going to do the operation. So that the formal arguments will going to get their value from the actual arguments. This formal arguments, from where it is getting the value? It is getting the value from actual arguments. That arguments will be termed as formal arguments or a dummy arguments. So let's see the example. Here this is a function definition. So within the function definition, I have a function header. What it will going to include? It has a return type, it has a name of a function, and it has a set of this argument list. So where this x, y and z will going to receive the value, that too with the help of this actual argument. So whatever the value that I am going to give for a, b, c, that will be copied to this x, y, z. Okay, so in my calling function, if I am using c is equal to big of 10, so here I have a c, so let me take d. D is equal to big of 10, 20, 30. Then these 10, 20, 30 is the actual arguments that I'm sending a values. These value will going to be assigned to this x as a 10, and for y it will be 20, and for z it will be 30. So whatever the value that has been sent from the actual argument to the formal parameters or to the dummy parameter, with the help of these value, it will going to perform the operation. Whatever the variables we have in a calling function, that is actual arguments. Whatever the variables that I am declaring in the function header or in the definition of a function will be termed as formal arguments or a dummy arguments. This is regarding what is arguments and types of arguments. Two types, actual and formal. So now we'll see about this variables. Already we know variables are the identifiers whose value will going to get changed during the execution of a program. Then what is the types of variables we have? We have two kinds of variable. One is local variable and another one is global variable. So local in the sense what? You just imagine you are sitting inside the class. Then you will be accessible only within the class. But when you are standing in the corridor, at that time, if the corridor is attached to 1 or 2 classes or 1 or 3 classes and all, then you will be accessible to all the classes. Then your position will be global in nature. But when you are restricted to some particular area, then it will be local variable. But the accessibility is more, or when we have a outside of the main function, then accessibility of that variable will be more. That is termed as what? Global variables. So we'll see about this local variables. The variables which is declared inside the function or a block is said to be belongs to that particular block. So as I said, when you are sitting inside a class, then it will be accessible only within the class. But when you are standing outside, then it will be accessible to the place where and all you can have. Like when you are standing outside or when you are accessible to more values, then will be termed as what? Global variables. So the variables declared inside a function or declared inside a particular block of statement, then that kind of variables will be accessible only within that particular block. So if I am using int a, in the void main, so this int a is accessible only within this main function. I can't use this int a even outside or after the main function, even the before the main function. Okay, so this will going to be restricted only within a block of statement or within a block. That kind of variable will going to be classified as a local variables. Then this value of this local variables are accessible only in that block. As I said, this a is only accessible only within this main function. I can't use this a even outside the main function, or I can't use it anywhere. So wherever it has been declared or wherever it has been within that particular block will be accessible only to that particular block itself. That kind of variables will be termed as local variables. The function's formal arguments are also considered as a local variables. What is this formal arguments? That is what I'm going to use in a function definition. Whatever the header I have, that function arguments are a list of variables is accessible only to the particular function. Okay, so that kind of arguments also, or that kind of parameters can also be termed as this local variables. So we'll see the general syntax and function here. So here I have a function name and variable I'm declaring, that is what int a comma int b. So that is what we are making a function definition. Function name is a function name itself here, and I have a int a comma b, and here I have int x comma y. I have x comma y, where I can use this x and y. This is only accessible, or it can only belong to the function name called function name. It can't be accessible outside the function. So this x and y will going to be termed as a local variable. Then what about this global variable? So if I wanted to use it anywhere in the program, it should not be restricted to particular block of functions, or it should not be defined, or it should not be used for a particular block of statement, then I'm going to make that as a global variable. I can use that global variable anywhere in my program, or I can have that global variables within the function itself. Okay, so now we'll see this global variables, the variables which is declared outside the functions. I'm declaring this variables which is outside the function will going to be termed as global function. Remember, main is also a function. I'm declaring this variables even before the main function. That kind of variables will be termed as what? Global variables, the variables which is declared outside the main function that I can say. Okay, so that kind of variables will be termed as global variables. So these variables are referred by the same data type and same name throughout the program, even in the calling function and in the called function. When I wanted to have any of the variable to be used in both calling function and called function without it changing its name or without changing its data type, then I have to make that variable as a global variable. For example, int a. So I just wanted to have this int a in throughout the program. That is what it can be in and here I have a int of sum of okay. So I just wanted to have this a even in calling function and even in the called function. At that time, if I'm using this a within this main function, then it can be accessible only within this block. But if I'm using this a in the called function, then also it will going to be used or it will be accessible only within this called function. But I want this a to be accessible even in both calling function and in the called function. Then I'm going to make this as a global variable instead of as a local variable. So I'm declaring this variable called a of the data type integer before the main function. Whatever we are going to declare before the main function, that variables will be termed as global variables. Then what is the situation whenever we are going to use this global variable? So whenever if some variables are to be treated as same value in both main function and even in another function. As I told, I wanted to have this a even in main function. I wanted to have it even in the main function and I wanted to use the same variable even in the called function or anywhere in the another functions also. In that time, we have to make this variable as a global variable. Then it is advisable to have this variables as a global variables. So here you can see the example, int a comma b. So I am declaring two variables called a comma b, which is of the data type integer. After that, I have a main function, void main. Within the opening and closing of flat braces, again I have int p comma q. Can you just specify which are the local variables and which are the global variables? I have this pq which will be accessible only within this main function. If I wanted to access it in another function, it is not possible. Why? Because these two are the local variables. But I have two more variables called a and b which has been declared before the main function. So I can call this as what? Global variables. I can use this a and b even in the main function, and if I have any other function, then also I can use this a comma b in my program, anywhere in a program. That kind of variables will be termed as what? Global variables. So now we'll see about the scope of variables. I got to know about the arguments, parameters, types of variables, that is local and global. Then what about the scope? So where you are accessible. So if you are admitting to any of the colleges, then you will be accessible to that college. I can't be call you as a student of another college. That means you belongs to this block of code. You have a scope in your college. Once you are done with your studies and all, and if you are moving from this college to another college, at that time your scope in this particular college will get over. That specifies the scope. So after the declaration, wherever you are accessible, so up to what time you will be here, what is the weightage of years when you are after the declaration, that kind of things will going to be termed as a scope of a variable. So the scope of a variable refers to the part of the program where the value of that variable can be used. So where I can use that function. Let me take one real-time example to make you understand the scope of a variable. You just consider some people, those who are in the government sector. What is their scope? So every time in this variable, scope will going to be start only when it is declared. So if I consider any government employee and all, their scope will going to get started only they get joined to that particular organization or any of the government sector. When the scope will going to ends, then when their service ends, at that time that scope of that particular employee will going to get over. In the same way, that value where the power can be used for the particular employee only when they are in the service. So when their service got over, they don't have any power, or I can't use the value of that particular variable. That specifies the scope. Once the declaration is done, then the scope of a variable will going to get started. So once its block got over, then it don't have any accessibility to that particular variable. That kind of things will be termed as what? Scope of a variable. That specifies that the part of the program where the value of the variable can be used. So this is regarding scope of a variable. The scope of the variable will going to be begins from where the declaration takes place. Only when that employee can have a power over the government sector, only they get joined into the organization or a sector, then only they can have a power. Their power will going to end only when the service got over. So when I am declaring any of the variables within that particular function, then the scope will going to be extend up to the end of that innermost block will going to end. So that means what? Within that block only, or from the declaration to the end of that function, that variable will going to have a scope. So this is regarding what? Scope of a variables. It's all about today's session. I hope you all understood with the particular topics that what I have done in my today's session. So in the next session, we are going to learn about the types of user-defined function. Already we got to know the types of function. What is that? It has been classified into two types. One is library function and another one is user-defined function. So in the next session, we will be discussing about the types of user-defined function, and also we are going to learn with this passing a default arguments to the function and pass by value along with a pass by reference. So this will be the content of my next session. I hope you all understood and enjoyed this session. Let me meet you in the next session with a continuation of this chapter itself. Until that, keep learning, keep on growing. Thank you.